Atomic Dreams, Chapter 1, The Land. Scott Lathrop took his first trip to Diablo Canyon in the early 1980s, when the plant was under construction. He was just a few years out of college. He had graduated from the California Polytechnic State University, Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo in 1976, with a degree in industrial technology. In October 1979, he'd been hired by the San Luis Obispo Department of Planning and Building to enforce building codes. PG&E needed permits for trailers they were using as temporary office spaces during the construction phase, and Scott's boss sent him out to the site to inspect them. He remembers driving out on the access roads, which hugged the coastline and cut through a sloped landscape of shrubs and sage bushes. Along the way, he stopped at the security kiosk where they were expecting him. It had been a bumpy time for PG&E, with a seemingly endless series of troubles surrounding the plant. Construction had begun in 1968. In 1969, an earthquake fault had been discovered a few miles from the site. This had necessitated systemic upgrades and given opponents who were already protesting vigorously new ammunition. In March of 1979, the particle meltdown at 3 Mile Island added momentum to the anti-nuclear movement around the country, leading to huge demonstrations in California and elsewhere. 3 months after the accident, about 30,000 people attended a rally and concert at a 50-acre Army airstrip just north of San Luis Obispo. Performers included Jackson Brownie, Graham Nash, and Bonnie Raitt. Governor Jerry Brown addressed the crowd, which gave him a 2-minute standing ovation, chanting, "No nukes, no nukes." Brown told them, "I personally intend to pursue every acre of appeal in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission ignores this community. I personally intend to pursue every avenue of appeal if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission ignores this community." It would seem that Scott and his family had good reason to protest, too. Their ancestors had lived on the land where the concrete was being poured, as well as the surrounding lands, which PG&E and its subsidiaries had also acquired. The territory occupied 12,000 acres, spanning 14 miles of shoreline on the central coast. It was covered in coastal sage and cherubal intersects with creeks that drained into the ocean. To the west, there were steep, wave-battered rock cliffs. To the east, the land sloped into hills and ridges. As the elevation increased, the vegetation shifted to grasslands, live oak, and bishop pines. And the place was full of birds. Brown towhees, lark sparrows, hummingbirds, and finches flitted about. Red-tailed hawks soared, turkey vultures hovered, mourning doves let out their melancholy hoots. The people who lived there were known as the Northern Chumash. Their houses were thatched domes, and the baskets were tight enough to hold water. They derived most of their substances from the sea, gathering clams and abalone, a kind of mollusk, and fishing with hooks crafted out of shells. They also hunted black-tailed deer with bows and arrows, and harvest acorns as well as the seeds of bunch grasses and chia. In 1775, 3 years after Mission St. Luis Obispo was established, Pedro Fages, a Spanish lieutenant, described the region in a report. It is not to be denied that this land excels all the preceding territory in fertility and abundance of things necessary for subsistence, he wrote. On or near the 12,000-acre plot of land that PG&E would later purchase, at least 5 small villages had once stood. Their population were decimated by exposure to the disease that the Spaniards brought: tuberculosis, measles, pneumonia. Infant mortality was especially high, and few children survived to adulthood, so that each generation was smaller than the last. Over time, more and more of the people who had lived there joined the mission, which meant moving to buildings in town the Spaniards called St. Louis Obispo. There were some holdouts, but gradually remaining in the villages became less tenable. The Spaniards held herds of sheep and cattle grazing on the same plains whose seed the North Chubsmash had previously gathered for food. Eventually, the villages were empty. In 1842, when California was still part of Mexico, the Mexican government gave the territory to private property owner in a land grant. By the 1960s, it belonged to a cattle company, which then sold it to PG&E. Although Scott didn't know it at the time, his ancestral village was just a few miles south of the plant site, on the surrounding PG&E-owned property. It was called I can't pronounce this, but I'll spell it out, Tsikyiw. And it was located right on the coast at the mouth of a creek. The Spanish had borrowed the name, translated as Peco, chest or breast in English, to refer to this entire area they called the Peco Coast. Scott was born and raised in St. Louis Obispo, the youngest of 6 kids. His family moved frequently from rental to rental. When he was about 5 years old, the family lived on the outskirts of the city, where his father worked for a farmer who grew alfalfa. Scott remembers riding in tractors and jumping on bales of hay. Later, they lived on the south side of the city, and his father secured work as a park ranger for the county. In retrospect, Scott's childhood seemed to him idyllic. People really don't know how great they had it, he told me. Growing up with Hispanics, blacks, Asians, all poor, trying to make it good. If a kid was getting out of line, he recalls, nearby adults would not hesitate to intervene. Hey, Scotty, stop it. There was a respect of parents. He had Native American ancestry on both sides of the family, but his mother emphasized his heritage more. Some of her family, from the Guanino band of Mission Indians, also called the ACJACHEHEMEN Nation, in Southern California, she made sure that all of her children were listed on the official roll of tribe members. As a result, when Scott was 16, he, his mother, and each of his siblings received a payment of $668.51, a total of $4,679.58 for the family as a part of land claim settlements authorized by Congress. His mother divvied up the money as she saw fit, giving Scott $1,200 to help him buy a 1968 Chevrolet Malibu. His father's side of the family, the northern Chubsmash side, didn't talk about their lineage much. Scott attributes their reticence to fear. They thought it was more prudent to claim Mexican or Spanish ancestry. These relatives, he said, probably weren't excited to get on any native list. They would have looked at it as more as a hit list. But although Scott didn't realize it until later, his father held on to some of the customs of his ancestors. He would gather abalone, which were abundant when Scott was a child, along the rocky coast, in certain areas in the period of low tide. Riding up almost up to your shoulders, you could actually pry abalone off the rocks. Scott recalled they would also dig for clams at Pismo Beach, located about 20 miles southeast of the Diablo Canyon, and Oceano Beach. A few miles farther south, and they'd go deer hunting on a hilly 40-acre plot of land outside the city that had been in the family for generations. The day Scott visited the plant to inspect the trailers, he parked his county vehicle in the parking lot, went through a search, and donned a hard hat and safety glasses. The two enormous containment domes loomed over him. Unit 1 appearing to be complete, workers were still putting the finishing touches on Unit 2. Construction workers in hard hats were everywhere. One of them happened to be Scott's eldest brother. Another was his brother-in-law. It was really strange because I was the young pup, he recalls. They were about 10 years older than I, and they're out there working like the worker bees, and I come out as the inspector. When they saw him, they ribbed him. They're like, "Get out of here." In 1968 and 1969, an archaeologist named Roberta Greenwood was commissioned by PG&E to excavate 6 sites that were to be destroyed by the construction. Among the materials she and her team exhumed were 66 burials, some whole skeletons, some in fragments. She found artifacts in these graves, whistles made of bone, painted stones, shell beads. In 1981, about 80 Native American supporters held a vigil at the plant site to protest the construction on the burial grounds. Scott was vaguely aware of some of this at the time. He thinks one of his cousins attended the vigil, but he didn't really participate in any protests against the nuclear plant. "I was not against it, and I was not in favor of it," he told me. "I was just dealing with reality." The plant was providing jobs in the community, which was just struggling economically, jobs for his relatives. The only major employer in the area were Cal Poly and agricultural concerns. In any case, nobody asked for his opinion or his blessing. This was decades before a series of state laws would begin to recognize indigenous groups, mandating that utilities and state agencies consult tribes at certain points in their decision-making process. It was also decades before he would get deeply involved with his tribe, talking on administrative duties and reading up on Native American history. It was before he learned how most tribes felt about nuclear power and before he reformed his own views. The site was an odd junction position, an industrial interfracture, in the midst of a wild land with ocean views. What Scott remembers most is awe at the scale of the construction project. The domes were made of concrete, almost 4 feet thick, reinforced with 6 layers of steel rebar and steel liner. They were still pouring concrete, and it was amazing to me to see the size of rebar and the amount of rebar that was put into that, he said. The dome houses his ancestors had lived in were about 10 feet high. These domes rose to 215 feet. Several trailer offices around the parking lot were already in use, and others there still needed to install. The latter required inspection of the concrete foundation. After he inspected the foundation, one of his workers asked him if he'd give the green light. "Oh yeah," he said, "no problem. I'll sign off on it." The worker called someone on the radio, and more workers materialized almost immediately. Scott had no inkling that almost 4 decades later he would return to the site numerous times in different capacities. He did not know how to feel about the land or how much time he would spend thinking and talking about the nuclear plant. "I was kind of naive," he told me. "I wouldn't have a clue back then."